Well, hi everybody. We it turns out failed to record our church service on Sunday morning, which was conducted over Zoom because of the snowstorm, because of the blizzard. And so I am doing my very, very best to recreate the sermon moment from Sunday um, here on Tuesday. So it is Tuesday, February the 1st, but we're going to pretend as though it is Sunday morning and as though this sermon is falling like fresh fallen snow. So here we go. Earlier in the service, I had us read the familiar parable that Jesus told about the sower and the seed that was scattered by that sower, because much of what I wanted to share and what I still wish to share this morning can be understood as a kind of commentary upon that parable. So keep that parable of the sower and the seed in in mind as we go here. Keep it in mind as I string this necklace of thoughts together. All right, so a confession. Winters during this long stretch of COVID in my life have been for reading. They're good for plugging the holes in one's literary exposure or for revisiting some of the books that have made an impression years before. Or so it's been for me anyway. Last year, I used winter to go through three massive novels, each of which I had read before. War and Peace was my January pick, Les Miserables was my February pick, and Don Quixote was for March. A book a month. There are some charming things about winter, and a snowstorm is one of them. But I do have to admit that on the whole, I don't really love this season. But last year's big winter COVID reads made me love it just a little bit more. And so this year I thought, why not do the same thing all over again, only with some different novels this time? January was devoted to Middlemarch. I just finished that novel a few days ago and I can recommend it highly. February is going to be Our Mutual Friend by Dickens. It's his last novel. And then March is going to be Pere Goriot from Balzac, and perhaps maybe another of his novels, since that one is considerably shorter than the others. Now, if you have any inclination to read along, let me know. It would be fun to do this in community. Now, I think of all of this as a response, a deeply theological response, actually, to that great scene in Augustine's Confessions when he hears a voice which he interprets as the voice of God saying to him, Tolle lege, which means take and read. You see, we have these beautiful, incredible testimonies of human life that have been inscribed and preserved for us. They are deposits of wisdom written as if to each one of us from ages past. There are so many seeds scattered by people in those ages past. And our lives then become the soil in which those seeds can either grow or become strangled and choked. Or maybe to shift the metaphor one more time, we can think of these great works of literature as hands extended to us from the past, which then we can reach for, joining our hands to theirs in this great chain of human understanding. I'll say more about that in just a little bit. I do happen to worry that fewer and fewer people seem willing, to say nothing of capable, of receiving the invitation that Augustine responded to take and to read. That means that the seeds that have been planted by those ages past can't grow or can't fully grow. And it means that the hands between past and present aren't really clasped at all. As we confront the emergence of a new authoritarian and some would say fascist spirit in our country and throughout the whole world, I actually believe that reading is one of the great tools that we have for preserving our own critical faculties. It's noteworthy that in 1984, Orwell imagines a future in which books will be burned. But in Huxley's Brave New World, we confront a reality far closer to our own, where books don't need to be burned because everyone's too distracted to bother reading them. Now, it also happens to be the case that there are movements afoot to ban a lot of books right now, and that's its own separate issue, but deeply related one. But that's my public service announcement for the day in the spirit of a certain St. Augustine. We must take and read as a theological act. We must let the seeds grow. We must take those outstretched hands from the past and clasp them. Now, the storm that we had this weekend was an opportunity to pivot from what I was intending to talk about and to pare things down just a little bit. And I thought I'd do that by sharing just one of the important themes that circulates through the novel Middlemarch, which simply has to do with leading a quiet and a decent life while trying one's best to be of use to those around us. It's a novel set in a small town, Middlemarch, set some distance from London, a town that actually reminded me quite a bit of our town and our region. The novel Middlemarch is one that Virginia Woolf said was one of the few English novels that was written for grown-ups. And I think she said that because it's a novel that isn't divided between good and bad characters or between heroes and villains. Except in very, very rare cases, most people in the novel and in life usually don't fit either of those categories especially well. Instead, the novel, and I think most of the world, is filled with individuals who look and feel a lot like most people I know, including myself. People who are not always fully self-aware. And from that lack of full self-awareness are making choices that can sometimes be for the good, but that other times can turn out to be quite messy. Though not usually because of malign intent. There are exceptions to that, I know, but for the most part, I think that's so. Mostly, I think people in this novel and people in the world are doing their best, even if they make compromises that do sometimes lead to unavoidable and unforeseen and sometimes really negative consequences. Now, Dorothea Brooke is one of those characters in the book Middlemarch. The story begins and it ends with Dorothea Brooke, but it frames her by referencing a saint. At the very beginning of the book, the narrator writes of a young Teresa of Avila, departing her household with her still younger brother to go and martyr herself in the service of a national ideal, in that case for Spain. Some family members find them and turn them back, thankfully. But while Teresa matured and her vision shifted, her devotion to an ideal larger than herself never, ever wavered. She went on to form a religious order and she became a famous theologian. But here's the difficulty. The difficulty, according to the narrator, is that a whole lot of Teresas are born into the world who are filled with noble ideals. Except most don't live that storied existence. Most of those Teresas, the narrator argues, are caught between their idealistic desires on one hand and circumstances that prevent them from achieving any kind of grandeur at all on the other hand. Here's what the book says. It says, "Here and there is born a Saint Teresa, foundress of nothing, whose loving heartbeats, after an unattained goodness, tremble off and are dispersed among hindrances, instead of centering in some long, recognizable deed." Now, what the book is announcing on its opening page is, in effect, that this is not going to be War and Peace. It's not going to be a story about people swept up into the great events of world history, in which their courage or their cowardice are tested. It's going to be a story about a provincial country town in which the forces of history enter only tangentially, and where the action of the novel is going to unfold in the very minute and sometimes microscopically tiny decisions by which human lives come to flourish or sometimes flounder. One of my very favorite moments in the book communicates that microscopic scale just beautifully. In it, a man who is struggling with both his health and the frustration of his life ambitions remaining somewhat thwarted, remains rigid, while his wife places her hand on his arm in a gesture of comfort and of shared support. She's trying to reach his discomfort. But the man stands in what George Eliot calls an unresponsive hardness. And then Eliot adds these wonderful words. She says, "It is in these acts, called trivialities, that the seeds of joy are forever wasted, until men and women look round with haggard faces at the devastation their own waste has made and say, 'The earth bears no harvest of sweetness,' calling their denial knowledge." I wonder how often you and I have squandered our joy in precisely such ways. No battles are fought. No lives are taken by another. No sweeping adventures take place. Instead, the action takes place in the smallest of gestures, where the seeds, here we are again with that metaphor, that parable of the seeds, where the seeds of a good and meaningful life are either nurtured, falling on good soil, or are squandered and wasted, as they were with that rigid man. So, in essence, George Eliot seems to be asking, what if nothing huge or earth shattering ever happened to you? What if you never got that big job? And say you never got famous? Say you never made the fortune you wished you did? And say you didn't fight in a great war or live through any kind of momentous event like that? Or say you made a mistake and that somehow you got stuck in your life? Say that outside your immediate family and maybe a handful of friends, say that you'll rest in a cemetery with a stone just like all those other stones that goes mostly unrecognized. Just say that between the grand intentions and the dreams of your youth, our youth, and the reality of our adult lives, there exists an unbridgeable chasm where the intention and the actuality, where the dream and the waking life never quite meet. Eliot seems to be asking us, would our lives have been in vain? She gives us an answer on the final page of the novel, when Teresa of Avila appears once again. You see, no matter the force of our will, and no matter how powerfully our candle is lit against the darkness, there is no person whose inner life is not greatly determined by forces outside of them, she tells us. Here's how she puts it more directly. She says, "A new Teresa will hardly have the opportunity of reforming a convent life, any more than a new Antigone will spend her heroic piety and daring, all for the sake of a brother's burial. The medium in which their ardent deeds took shape is forever gone. only for a very, very few, in other words? Does the medium of their existence match the ardor of their ideals and of their wishes? And thanks be to God that there are those whose lives and circumstances perfectly match. Those are the ones that we call the reformers and the heroes. Those are the MLKs and the Fannie Lou Hamers and the Abraham Lincolns and the St. Teresas. But Eliot goes on. She says, but we insignificant people, with our daily words and acts, are preparing the lives of many anonymous Teresas, whose nature will spend itself in channels which had no great name on the earth. But the effect of such people on those around them is incalculably diffusive. For the growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts. That in turn brings me around to all of us, gathered in our living rooms, whether on the winter day on which I first preached this sermon, or now as you're watching this. There are times, I suspect, that we're tempted to measure our worth by the ways, to use the argot of the moment, we're out there transforming our world. Faith and our ethical responses to the issues of the day are so often understood to involve what I like to call, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, manly deeds of ethical valor. Our imaginations have been shaped by the very powerful and important stories of faith leaders or other reformers who have stood up to the forces of ignorance or intolerance and who have won. They march, they argue, they demonstrate, they go to jail. Sometimes they're martyred. And when we don't do those things, I think that sometimes we're tempted to feel as though we're not measuring up, as though our lives and the ways in which we live our faith are somehow less than those of those great heroes. Middlemarch, it turns out, is a feminist intervention in that line of manly and heroic thinking. For while it doesn't discount the need to fight the power, it opens up a different theater of action, where the minute and the barely perceptible gestures, like that unyielding and inflexible arm, impervious to tenderness, contain the seeds of our flourishing or our withering. Here's what I'm trying to tell you. It's really tempting in this long season of COVID to think that nothing much is happening in our lives. It's tempting to think that we should always be out there making a difference and changing the world and transforming the culture and so forth. When we're not doing those things, or when we're not able to do those things because of a pandemic or because of a winter storm, for whatever reason. Sometimes it's just restriction on our movement, or sometimes it's a shutdown, or sometimes it's aging. When we're not able to do those things, we sometimes are tempted to feel insufficient. And it is true that sometimes we need the grand gestures. But we must not miss a still more powerful truth, which is that each of us, in our smallest gestures, in our smallest actions, in the ways that we invite conversation, and in the ways that we ask interested questions of others, in the ways that we care for and connect to one another, I think in all of those ways, we're actually hard at work building the future already, whether we know it or not. And it's not only the web of supportive relationships that we're building in our direct actions. I want to include the ways we spend our money in that as well. Money, it turns out, is one of the great themes that's running through the novel Middlemarch. I was reminded of that last week when Mary Tomasetti put out her video about the things that we choose to buy or not to buy, and the ways in which that helped me to think of how we spend our money is an important way of having a positive effect upon others that is incalculably diffusive. Think of it like this. Think of money as a kind of language where each and every dollar that we spend is akin to a word that we utter. Sometimes with many dollars, it's as though it's a sentence or a paragraph. We're putting meaning into the world in the ways that we put our money into the world. And I think we have the capacity with our consumer choices and with the money we give away to speak a supportive and a compassionate language that, in small but in very meaningful gestures, winds up preparing the way for all those anonymous St. Teresas who are still to be born. I'm going to end by using or returning to the metaphor that I started out with early on, which is that of those outstretched hands, or maybe they're like this, stretched this way. It's deposits of wisdom from the past, such as Middlemarch, our hands outstretched to our own. And we can take those hands in times of trouble. And I think our lives will be immeasurably enriched. But I want us not to forget a corollary truth. You see, our hands must extend not only backward, that's the direction of backward, I suppose, but also forward in a different direction, toward the future, toward all of those who are still to come, and who one day are going to need to reach out for our hands, to clasp our hands in their own time of need. The ways we reach toward them will certainly be found in the grandiose gestures we accomplish as a community of faith. But I think they'll also be accomplished, whether we know it or realize it or not, by those smaller touches, which is to say, by the quiet ways we go about creating lives of understanding and grace in our words, in our gestures, in the use of our time, in our creativity, and yes, in the language that we speak with our money. Those two are ways of extending our hands out there toward the future so that others who are still to come can reach on and grasp our hands. Or maybe to shift the metaphor just one last time, those are ways of sowing good seeds. Seeds that in time and in ways that we can scarcely foresee will grow into inhabitable gardens. All right, that's what I've got. Take two. I hope you're well out there, and I hope to see you soon. Take care. Love to you all. Bye.